My name is Mitloehner. I'm an air quality specialist in the Department of Animal Science at UC Davis. The paper that I'm about to present was a joint piece of work titled Air Issues Associated with Animal Agriculture in North American Perspective. It's free for download, and it was published as part of the CAST series. My co-authors were Larry Jacobson, Brent Overman, Ray Massey, Alan Sutton, and Hongwei Chin. When talking about air pollution, air quality associated with animal agriculture, there are really several main categories to cover. The one is what generates emissions. So what source is of interest? It could be a dairy and different sources within a dairy. It could be a tractor. It could be all different kinds of individual emission sources. Second portion of the pollution life cycle deals with where the pollutants end up, where they travel to, and where they end up being. Number 3 is deposition. Once the pollutants are emitted, sooner or later they have to come down someplace, and that could be within a human or animal respiratory system, or it could be on some ecological surface, like a lake, for example. The fourth portion of pollution life cycle deals with regulation and mitigation, and of course this is a very important section of our work as well. So this slide here shows a couple of sources of emissions. See on the top left a dairy emitting some heifer dust. On the top right you see dust associated with land preparation. Bottom left you see an unlikely source of air pollution, but nevertheless wineries are a source of air pollution, and on the bottom right you see orchards. This slide here was taken at a dairy in Southern California. What you see here on the left side of the fence is a dairy with 1,000 cows, and on the right side newly settled residential areas. This is very often grounds for litigation, where people move next to agricultural producers and then sue the producer for dust and odors and flies and so on. This slide here shows very nicely how topography affects air quality. You see a satellite image of California. On the one side of this smog plume, you see the Sierra Nevada. On the right side, here the Sierra Nevada. On the left side, the coastal mountain range. And this area here in the middle, that's smog that surrounds the San Joaquin Valley, or that is in midst of the San Joaquin Valley. The San Joaquin Valley with Fresno in the center is known to be the worst air quality designation in the United States, followed by Los Angeles, followed by Houston, Texas. This slide here shows very nicely what I just alluded to with respect to transport. You see Australia down here, bottom left, and then you see China up here, and the United States over here to the right. In between, of course, the Pacific Ocean. And once I animate this slide, you will see how pollution travels. It takes about 4 days for pollution to travel from China to the United States, and this is a great example of how we can track that pollution. So this slide is really there to show that it's not just good enough to reduce pollution where we live, but also in other areas of the world, so that we prevent it from getting over here. As I said, deposition is very important, where pollutants end up, where their fate is, and here you see on the left side alveoli in a healthy human being, wide open without any kind of debris or so inside, and on the right side you see alveoli that are infiltrated with dust particles, and on top of these dust particles are pathogens that have found their way into the airways by means of these particles. I will now show you a couple of slides that show what kind of air pollutants are relevant in different parts of the United States. The first one is ozone. It's very clear that California is the hotspot for ozone or smog. The number 2 area is Houston, Texas. And then there are some hotspots in the east and the Midwest. But California clearly is the number 1 area of concern. Particulate matter smaller than 10 microns are also a problem in parts of the West, particularly again in California, in Arizona, in parts of Nevada, but also in parts of Washington State, that is. Particulate matter 2.5, these are particles smaller than 2.5 microns, are again a concern in California and in parts of the east of the United States. So in general, what are environmental quality issues? National ambient air quality standards like particulate matter or ozone are areas of concern. Hazardous air pollutants, visibility or impaired visibility, air deposition, and more important becomes the area of global climate change. Last not least are odors. Odors are what really gets producers into trouble. That's the main area why people are being sued, producers being sued. These are the pollutants of concern: particulate matter 10, particulate matter 2.5, then ammonia, volatile organic compounds which form smog or ozone, hydrogen sulfide, the greenhouse gas methane, and then oxides of nitrogen which can form smog, along with volatile organic compounds. There were a couple of publications that have summarized really nicely what the main issues are associated with air emissions from animal feeding operations. The first one on the left is a National Research Council publication. The one on the right is a publication that was put out by the United Nations FAO titled Livestock's Long Shadow. There are different pollutants here on the left that have different significance in both regional, national, and global scales. And this slide shows what these different pollutants are. I will not go into the details there. Gaseous emissions in general are generated by microbial processes that occur both in feed and in manure. And whether or not these microbial processes occur under anaerobic or aerobic conditions, that determines what kind of pollutants are generated. So, for example, under anaerobic conditions, we form ammonia, hydrogen sulfide, methane, and volatile organic compounds. And then there are other ones that are generated once you have oxygen present. Particulate matter can be generated from manure, from soil, from feathers, from feedstuffs, and so on. And whether or not these particles are generated is determined by moisture, air movement, animal activity, and so forth. Emission control, of course, is a very relevant topic. That's the area of mitigation. We can have different ways of mitigating emissions. Inhibition, suppression, and emission control are the main means. And this slide shows or summarizes emission controls. Just a few slides showing what recent efforts have been undertaken in order to quantify emissions, help predict emissions, but also mitigate emissions. The first one is a slide showing the National Air Emission Monitoring Study, a large study that was conducted throughout the United States on numerous different livestock and poultry facilities. It shows a freestall barn on the top left where cows stand and manure emits whatever kind of gases come off, and these gases are traveling through a tubing system into a trailer, which you see on the top right and the bottom right, and inside the trailer are analyzers that quantify those emissions. So this study was completed. It was conducted by 5 land-grant universities and is overseen by EPA. The leader of this project was Purdue University and Al Heber in particular. The other projects underway, and these are basically projects that help model air emissions, so-called process-based models that basically predict what kind of emissions you can expect under different conditions on your operation. So with different temperatures and pH and so on, what kind of emissions can you get? There are other studies underway that look at the impact of air pollutants on health, like this one here. Then there are numerous facilities that have been built across the United States that allow experimental work in and with animals and waste and feed and so on. And of course there are numerous extension efforts throughout the United States underway because many of our producers are now being regulated for emissions from their operations, and they are told to use certain mitigation, and of course producers in most cases don't really know what to do and what it means and how to fill out paperwork and so on. So extension efforts are underway. A few words to a publication that has received a lot of airtime over the last couple of years, and that's Livestock's Long Shadow, a United Nations FAO report published in 2006, which said that the livestock sector is a major player responsible for 18% of all greenhouse gases, and that this is a higher share than transportation. My lab has investigated the 18% and also whether or not the livestock versus transportation comparison is accurate. And we have published Clearing the Air, Livestock's Contribution to Climate Change, a publication that looked at the number and the comparison. And what we found was that the comparison of livestock to transportation was really inaccurate. And the reason being that different methodologies had been used to assess the carbon footprint of livestock versus transportation. For livestock, they used what's called a true life cycle assessment, looking at all components of livestock production. And for transportation, they only looked at the burning of gas, not the other aspects of transportation, like the drilling for oil and the transportation of oil, the refining of oil, the building of cars, trucks, trains, planes, ships, and so on. So it was really an inaccurate comparison to make. And the FAO has since accepted that criticism, and they have done some follow-up work. In the United States, all of livestock combined produces 3.4% of all greenhouse gases, and certainly not 18. So the EPA concurs with that. This is an emission inventory by the EPA. On the x-axis, we see the years 1990 to 2008. On the y-axis, the total amount of greenhouse gases. According to the EPA, the main culprit for greenhouse gas emissions is clearly energy production and use and transportation. Transportation is responsible for 26%, electricity production and use 31%, and livestock 3.4%. Now, the picture is very different across the world. This slide shows two graphs from Livestock's Long Shadow. On the left side, the greenhouse gases from 1990 to 2020 in the developing regions of the world, and we can see that these greenhouse gases are increasing over the years. And on the right side, it shows the developed regions, so where we have much lower concentrations or emissions and plateauing emissions. And the reason for this difference is that we have learned to become very efficient here. The United Nations FAO since came out with this greenhouse gas assessment for the dairy sector. They looked at the different regions in the world, and on the left side you see North America, and you can clearly see that North America's dairy production has the lowest carbon footprint from any place in the world. The reason again is the efficiency. Just really briefly, today there are 9 million dairy cows in the US, 16 million fewer than in World War II. Even though the numbers of cows have decreased dramatically, milk production has increased by 60%, and that means that the carbon footprint today versus in the Second World War is 2/3 smaller, and that means we have become much more efficient, and therefore we have much smaller environmental impact. Really briefly, and at the end here, research needs are significant. We need to look at health and environmental impacts, standard measurement protocols, process-based models to predict emissions. We have to improve transport and fade-off emissions, and work on mitigation. And with that, I leave you with my contact information, and I know this was a very brief overview. I only had 15 minutes, but I'm happy to entertain any additional questions and communicate with whoever has interest in finding out more. Thank you very much.